हेलो फ्रेंड्स। हम अपनी इंडियन पॉलिटी एंड गवर्नेंस की सीरीज़ को आगे कंटिन्यू करते हैं। हमने पिछली वीडियो में द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल डेवलपमेंट ऑफ इंडिया को कंप्लीट किया था। उसके कुछ थ्योरी पार्ट पढ़े थे और 8 क्वेश्चन थे उसमें। उस क्वेश्चन को कंप्लीट किया। नेक्स्ट, एक्ट्स पास्ड अंडर द ब्रिटिश क्राउन्स 1858 एंड 1947। इसके कुछ थ्योरी पार्ट्स, फिर उसके बाद हम इसके क्वेश्चंस कंप्लीट करेंगे। सो फ्रेंड्स, ये इंडियन पॉलिटी एंड गवर्नेंस की सीरीज़ बहुत इम्पॉर्टेंट है। आप किसी भी एग्ज़ाम में पॉलिटिक्स के क्वेश्चन पूछे जाते हैं, चाहे वो UPPCS हो, RO हो, SSC हो या अदर किसी भी एग्ज़ाम में हो, सबके लिए कुछ इम्पॉर्टेंट क्वेश्चंस हैं। सो आप इस सीरीज़ को पूरी कंटिन्यू करेंगे। इसकी एक अलग प्लेलिस्ट बन गई है, आप उस प्लेलिस्ट को स्टार्टिंग से देख लीजिए। उस जितने भी वीडियोस इंडियन पॉलिटी एंड गवर्नेंस के होंगे सारे उस प्लेलिस्ट में अपलोड कर दिए जाएंगे। सो फ्रेंड्स, हम नेक्स्ट एक्ट्स पास्ड अंडर द ब्रिटिश क्राउन्स की थ्योरी पार्ट को पढ़ते हैं। द ब्रिटिश क्राउन्स डिसाइडेड टू एज्यूम सॉवरेनिटी ओवर इंडियाज फ्रॉम द ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी by the Government of India Act 1858. The name of the post governor was renamed as a viceroy. जो पोस्ट की गवर्नर थी, जो गवर्नर जनरल की पोस्ट थी, उसका नाम अब वायसराय कर दिया गया था। ही बिकम डायरेक्ट रिप्रेजेंटेटिव ऑफ ब्रिटिश क्राउन, और ये डायरेक्ट ब्रिटिश क्राउन्स के ही रिप्रेजेंटेटिव थे। लॉर्ड कैनिंग्स become the first viceroy of India's board of controls and board of control and court of director come to end. The new post secretary of the state of India was created. So अब जो वायसराय थे वो डायरेक्ट रिप्रेजेंटेटिव थे ब्रिटिश क्राउन के, और लॉर्ड कैनिंग पहले वायसराय ऑफ इंडिया के थे, और जो बोर्ड ऑफ कंट्रोल एंड बोर्ड ऑफ डायरेक्टर्स थी उनको इंड कर दिया गया। अब न्यू पोस्ट बनाई गई, सेक्रेटरी ऑफ द स्टेट ऑफ इंडिया वाज क्रिएटेड। ही असिस्टेड बाय द काउंसिल ऑफ 15 मेंबर्स। ही रिसीव्ड पावर सो लॉन्ग enjoy by the court of directors and the board of control. The council of India was to be advisory in nature. Most cases, the initiatives and the final decisions remained with the Secretary of the State of India. India Council Act 1861 initiated the participations of Indian representatives in lawmakings. The Act restores the legislative powers, making and amending laws to the province of Madras, Bombay, and thus initiating the processes of decentralizations. The Act empowered the viceroys to issue ordinances in case of emergency, which were not to remain in force for more than 6 months. Indian Council Act 1892 increased the number of non-official members, both central and the provincial legislative council, but maintained the official majority in them. The Indian members were granted the right to ask questions and discuss the budget. The legislative councils, जो इंडियन काउंसिल एक्ट 1892 था, उसमें नॉन ऑफिशियल्स मेंबर को सेंट्रल लेवल और प्रोविंस लेवल दोनों पे इंक्रीज़ कर दिया गया था, और उनको राइट दिया गया था कि वो क्वेश्चन आस्क एंड डिस्कस द बजट ऑफ द लेजिस्लेटिव काउंसिल्स. द एक्ट इंट्रोड्यूस द इलेक्शन इन लिमिटेड सेंस थ्रू द वर्ड इलेक्शंस was very carefully avoided. In it, Indian Council Act 1909 is also known by the Parliamentary reforms. It provided for the associations of Indians with the executives, councils, viceroy, and the governor. Satyendra Prasad Sinha became the first Indian who joined viceroy of executive councils. He was appointed as a long member. The functions and the size of the legislatures both at the center and in the province were enlarged. The members of the councils were given the right of discussions and asking supplementary questions. The acts provided separate electorates of Muslims, hence Lord Minto come to be known as father of communal electorates. So friend, India Council Act 2019 टू 1919 उसको हम मौले मिंटो रिफॉर्म से जानते हैं. इसने प्रोवाइड किया था एग्जीक्यूटिव काउंसिल में इंडियंस को जगह, और पहले सत्येंद्र प्रसाद सिन्हा जो बिकम द फर्स्ट इंडियन जॉइन वाइसरॉय ऑफ एग्जीक्यूटिव काउंसिल. तो ये पहले मेंबर थे जिन्होंने वाइसरॉय एग्जीक्यूटिव काउंसिल को ज्वाइन किया. एंड ही अपॉइंटेड एज अ लॉ मेंबर की तरह वो अपॉइंट हुए थे. एंड दिस काउंसिल एक्ट्स 1909 और मॉर्गन रिफॉर्म्स. दिस एक्ट्स ऑल्सो सेपरेट, ये हिंदू और मुस्लिम्स को अलग से सेपरेट इलेक्टोरेट प्रोवाइड करा रहा था. हेंस इस वजह से मौले लॉर्ड मिंटो को फादर ऑफ कम्युनल इलेक्टोरेट भी कहा जाता है. गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया एक्ट 1919 इज ऑल्सो नोन एज द मॉन्टेगू चेम्सफोर्ड रिफॉर्म्स. तो जो गवर्नमेंट इंडिया ऑफ एक्ट 1919 था उसको मॉन्टेगू चेम्सफोर्ड रिफॉर्म भी कहते हैं. दिस एक्ट फॉर द फर्स्ट टाइम्स adopted a direct election systems. Principle of communal representations was extended by providing a separate electorate of Sikhs, Indian Christians, Europeans and Anglo-Indians. जो 1909 एक्ट्स था जिसे हम इंडियन काउंसिल एक्ट 1909 कहते हैं या मॉर्ले मिंटो रिफॉर्म कहते हैं. उसमें तो मुस्लिम्स को एक अलग इलेक्टोरेट या इलेक्टोरेट कर प्रोवाइड कराया गया था. लेकिन जो मॉन्टेगू चेम्सफोर्ड रिफॉर्म था 1919 को, उसमें इसको और बढ़ा दिया गया और इसमें मुस्लिम्स को ही नहीं, अलग से रिप्रेजेंटेशन के लिए सिख्स को, इंडियन क्रिश्चियन को, यूरोपियन को एंड एंग्लो इंडियंस को भी दे दिया गया. और मॉन्टेगू चेम्सफोर्ड रिफॉर्म्स इट इंट्रोड्यूस बाईकैमरलिज्म एंड सेंट्रल लेवल पे भी बाईकैमरलिज्म मॉन्टेगू चेम्सफोर्ड रिफॉर्म में आया था 1919 में. इट सेपरेटेड द वेरियस सब्जेक्ट्स एज अ सेंट्रल्स एंड प्रोविंशियल सब्जेक्ट्स. The bicameralism central legislative could make law for the whole British Indias. It introduced diarchy in the province. और इसने डायरकी प्रोविंस में इंट्रोड्यूस कर दी थी 1919 में. बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट ये पूछा जाता है. It introduced diarchy in the province. The province subjects were further divided into two parts, transfers and reserve. For the first times, the terms responsible government was used. Under these acts, a commission was to be constituted after 10 years, which will review the working of this act and present its reports. In November 1927, that is 2 years before schedules, the British government announced appointment of the 7-member statutory commission under the chairmanship of Simon to report on the condition of India's under its new constitution. The constitution was hence called Simon Commission. Government of India Act 1935 provided the establishment of an all India federation constituting of province and the princely states as units. It introduced diarchy at centers and abolished the shame in the province. It provided the establishment of Reserve Bank of India to controls the currency and the credit of country. So Government of India Acts भी बहुत इम्पॉर्टेंट है. गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया एक्ट्स हमें प्रोवाइड करता है ऑल इंडिया फेडरेशंस, प्रोविंस एंड द प्रिंसली स्टेट. इट वाज इंट्रोड्यूस्ड डायरकी इन एट द सेंटर लेवल्स. तो गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया एक्ट 1919 में डायरकी इंट्रोड्यूस की थी प्रोविंशियल लेवल पे बाई कैमरलिज्म किया गया था। और गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया एक्ट 1935 में डायरेक्ट इंट्रोड्यूस एट द सेंट्रल लेवल एंड एबॉलिश द सेम इन द प्रोविंस, और प्रोविंस में हटा दिया गया था डायरेक्टली। इट प्रोवाइडेड एस्टेब्लिशमेंट ऑफ रिजर्व बैंक, और रिजर्व बैंक ऑफ इंडिया भी गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया एक्ट में ही आया, टू कंट्रोल करेंसी एंड द क्रेडिट ऑफ कंट्रीज। Principles of communal representation was further extended by providing a separate electorate for scheduled caste as women's laborers. So गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया 1935 एक्ट्स में जो कम्युनल रिप्रेजेंटेशन था उसको और एक्सटेंड कर दिया गया। गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया एक्ट 1909 में मुस्लिम को दिया गया, 1919 में सिख, क्रिश्चियंस, यूरोपियन, एंग्लो इंडियन को दिया गया, और 1935 में और उसको एक्सटेंड कर करके शेड्यूल कास्ट, वुमेन्स एंड लेबर सबको दे दिया गया। अ फेडरल कोर्ट वाज सेटअप्स इन 1937 थ्रू दिस एक्ट्स। एक फेडरल कोर्ट भी बनाई गई 1935 के एक्ट, और सेटअप किया गया 1937 में। द एक्ट सेपरेट्स बर्मा फ्रॉम द ब्रिटिश इंडिया टू इस्टेब्लिश न्यू प्रोविंस सिंध एंड ओडिशास। It introduced bicameralism in 6 out of 11 provinces, and India Independence Act of 1947 declared to be the Indian and the sovereign nation of 15 August 1947. It abolished the viceroys and the governor generals was appointed to each dominion. It dropped the title of Emperor of India from the royal titles, the Kings of England. So India Independence Act 1947 में को डिक्लेयर किया गया। 15 अगस्त 1947 में इंडिया को आज़ाद किया गया, एक सॉवरेन नेशन किया, और जितने भी वायसराय और गवर्नर जनरल की पोस्ट थी उसको एबॉलिश कर दिया गया। एंड अ गवर्नर जनरल वाज अपॉइंटेड फॉर ईच डोमिनियंस। डोमिनियंस के लिए गवर्नर जनरल अपॉइंट किया गया। इट वाज ड्रॉप टाइटल्स एम्परर ऑफ इंडिया, जो एम्परर ऑफ इंडिया के टाइटल्स उसको ड्रॉप कर दिया गया फ्रॉम द रॉयल टाइटल्स, द किंग्स ऑफ द इंग्लैंड। जो क्वेश्चंस फर्स्ट यहाँ से स्टार्ट होते हैं, इसमें भी लगभग है 33 क्वेश्चंस हैं। सो फर्स्ट क्वेश्चन देखते हैं क्या है इसमें। रीड द फॉलोइंग स्टेटमेंट्स विथ रेफरेंस टू द इंडियन काउंसिल्स एक्ट 1861 एंड चूज द करेक्ट ऑप्शंस। As a result of this act, total number of the executive councils of the governor general becomes 7. For legislative works, number of the additional members could be minimum 6 and maximum of 12. No differentiation between the state and the central subject. So option second और third सही होगा। Indian Council Act 1861 transformed the Viceroy Executive Council into a miniature cabinet running on the portfolio systems. All the 5 members were assigned in a department out of revenue, finance, law and homes and military as the head of the executive functions. In 1874, a 6th member was added to the executive councils for public work department. For legislative works, numbers of additional members was determined to be minimum 6 and the maximum 12, which were to be nominated by the Viceroy for 2 years at least. Half of the additional members were to be non-official. No differentiation was made between the central and the provincial. So इस तरीके से ऑप्शन बी is correct. Read the following statements with respect to Indian Council Act 1892 and choose the correct options. Question 2 है, it was implemented on 20th June 1892. Out of 24 members, 5 were non-government members. Members were given right to ask supplementary questions. So इसका आंसर कंफर्म नहीं है। The British Parliament passed Indian Council Act 1892. It was gathered a royal assent on June 1892, 20 June 1892. So फर्स्ट ऑप्शन तो करेक्ट लग रहा है। and was commenced on 3 February 1893. लेकिन वो आया था, कमेंस्ड हुआ था 3 फरवरी 1893 में, 93 में. The statement first is wrong. The number of additional members elected to the Governor General's councils was increased minimum 10 to maximum 16 members. Among these additional members, at least half had to be non-officials. Thus, as per rules of this act, in this additional members, 6 were officials and 10 were the non-officials. In the non-official members, both Indians and Europeans are included. Thus, statement second is wrong. In this act's right to discuss the budgets was given, but the members were not given the right to ask supplementary questions. Thus, statement third is also wrong. So तीनों ही आंसर गलत थे इस इंडियन काउंसिल एक्ट में. सप्लीमेंट्री क्वेश्चंस पूछने की इजाज़त नहीं थी. Under which of the following act legislative councils of India received the power to discuss budget? Indian Council Act 1892. In Indian Council Act 1892 increased the functioning of the legislative councils. The council was given the power to discuss budget but not the power to vote. The act permitted addressing questions to the executive with prior notice of 6 days, but the power to ask supplementary questions was not given. Question 4. Which of the following acts provided a communal representation of the British Indias? Monumental Reform 1909. Indian Council Act 1909 introduced a separate electorate for communal representation to the Muslim communities and thus sowed the seeds of separatism that eventually led to the partition of the countries. तो मोनुमेंटल रिफॉर्म्स या इंडियन काउंसिल एक्ट 1919 ही कम्युनल रिप्रेजेंटेशंस प्रोवाइड करता है. क्वेश्चन 5. द एक्ट 1919 was associated introducing of separate electorates. Option A is correct. By which one of the following acts was a federal court in India created? वो 1935 एक्ट में किया गया था, बट इसमें दिया नहीं है. सो ऑप्शन डी नन ऑफ द फेडरल कोर्ट ऑफ इंडिया वाज एस्टेब्लिश 1 अक्टूबर 1937 बाय द गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया एक्ट 1935. सर मोनराइस गवायर was the first chief justice. Hence, option D is correct answer. Sir Nourish Gawar. The Federal Courts of India was established in the following year, 1937. Under which of the following acts hierarchy was introduced at the central level? Government of India Act 1935. The silent feature of Government of India Acts, the hierarchy was introduced at the central levels. The province hierarchy as envisaged in the Government of India Act 1919 was abolished. Central subjects were provided into reserves and transport subjects. The Government of India Act 1935 proposed to set up all India Federation comprising of the British India province and the provincial states. The supremacy of the British Parliament remained in act under the Government of India Act 1935. Burma was separated from India with effect from April 1937. The Government of India Act 1935 abolished the Council of the Secretary of the State for Indias, which was created in 1858. The Federal Courts of India was established on 1 October 1937. Sir Maurice Gawar was the first Chief Justice. The Central Federal Bank was established under the Act, which later known as the Reserve Bank of India Act. Question 9. Which of the following acts Set up hierarchy system at the central level. Government of India Act 1935. Which of the following is are the principal feature of Government of India Act 1919? The introduction of hierarchy in the executive government of province, the introduction of separate communities of the Muslims, ये गलत है. Devolution of the legislative authority by the center to the province, devolution of legislative authority by the center to province. So option first and third is correct. The Government of India Act 1919 was passed by the British Parliament. The act embodied the reforms recommended in the reports of the Secretary of the State of India, Edwin Montagu, and the Viceroy Lord Chelmsford. The acts provided for the introduction of dual form of government in the province known as diarchy. The subject of administration were divided into two categories: reserve and transport. Reserve subjects were kept under the provincial governor and the executive council, while transport subjects were kept under the ministers responsible to the provincial legislature. The distribution of power between centre and the province was done in the form of federal and the province subject. As far as the question of separate electoral systems for the Muslims is concerned, the provisions had already been made by the Act of India 1909. The Government of India Acts 1919 continued this province and also extended it Sikhs, Europeans, Indian Christians, and Anglo-Indians. In the context of Indian history, the principle of diarchy refers to division of centers into two houses, introduction of double government, central and the state governments having two sets rules, one in London and another in Delhi, division of subject delegated to province into two categories. So option C is correct. Diarchy was derived the Greek words diarch, which means double rules. In the context of Indian history, the principle of diarchy refers division of the provincial subject into reserve and the transfer categories. Comparative important subject, reserve subject, such as police, jails, and finance and irrigations were to be administered by the governor and his executive councils without being responsible to the legislative council. Subjects of lesser importance, transfer subjects such as education, agriculture, local self-government, etc. were to be administered by the governor with the aid of ministers responsible to the legislative councils. Question to us. In the Government of India Act 1919, the function of provincial governments were divided into reserve and transfer subject. Which of the following were treated as a reserve subject? Administration of justice, local and self-government, land revenue, police. So administration of justice, land revenue, and police. So option C is correct. The Government of India Act 1919 introduced hierarchy at the provincial level. The provincial government subject were separated into two divisions: reserve subject and the transfer subject. Subject under the transfer list are local self-government, public work, health and sanitation, industrial research and education. The subject included as reserve list are judicial, administration, press, land revenues, forest, water and labor dispute settlements, agriculture loans, police and prisons. Thus option C is correct. Which act established hierarchy system in the province? Government of India Act 1990s. The Government of India Act 1990, also known as Montagu-Chelmsford Reform, was passed by the British Parliament with the objective of the gradual introductions of responsible government in India. It introduced a system of dual governments at the province level. Subjects were divided into two categories. First, reserve subjects. This includes important areas like law and orders, finance and land revenue and irrigations. These remains under the direct control of British governor of his executive councils. To transfer subjects, these include states less critical areas like education, health, public works and agriculture. This dual schemes of the governor was known as diarchy, a term diarchy from the Greek word diarch, which means double rules. It also introduced for the first time bicameralism and direct elections in the countries. Indian legislative was made bicameralism for first times. Government of India Act 1919. Government of India Act 1919 made Indian legislative bicameralism for the first times. It was consist upper house named the Council of the States and lower house named Council of the Legislative Assemblies. Council of the State was composed of 6 members, of whom maximum 20 members could be officials in accordance with the sections of 18 of the Government of India Act 1919. The lower house is called the Central Legislative Assemblies and under the section 19 of this act. It originally provided for 140 members with elected 100 elected and 40 nominated. It is noteworthy that under the rules made for the implementation of 1919 Act's provisions was made for 60 members with 33 electeds and 27 nominated in the Council of the State, while the member of the Central Legislative Assemblies was increased first to 143, 102 elected and 41 nominated, and then to 145, 104 elected and 41 nominated. It is notable that one member of each houses was from the Berar out of the nominated member due to a members from the Berar being nominated as a result of an election held in Berar. It has been included in the member of the elected members of in many mentions. Question 15. Which of the following act introduced bicameralism at the central level? Government of India Act 1919. Bicameralism. Bicameral Legislature at central level. Government of India Act 1919. Consider the following statement. The Montagu-Chelmsford reform of 1990 is recommended granted voting right to all women above the age of 21. Government of India Act 1935 gave women reserved seat in legislature. So option B is correct. The Government of India Act 1935 gave a woman reserved seat in legislature. In 1918, when Britain granted limited suffrage to women's property holders, the law did not apply to British citizens in other parts of the empire. Despite all Indian women deputations led by Sarojini Naidu and Edwin Samuels Montagu, then Secretary of the State, Indian women's demands were ignored in the Montagu-Chelmsford reform. Though women were not granted voting right nor the rights to stand in election, the Government of India Act 1919 allowed provincial councils to determine women could vote, provided they met stringent property, incomes or educational level. Hence, statement 1 is not correct, and statement 2 is correct, as the Government of India Act 1935 extend the principles of the communal represented by providing separate electoral or depressed class, scheduled caste, and women and laborer. Question 17. With reference to Indian civil services, which of the following statement is are correct? Government of India Act 1919 provided for separate examinations for the Indian civil services, which was to be held in India. The Indian civil services in 1941, the percentage of Indians was more as compared to Europeans. So options C, both first and second correct. The Government of India Act 1990 provides separate examinations for Indian civil services, which was held in India's and in Indian civil services in 1941. The percentage of Indians was more as compared to Europeans. Both the statements are covered following Lord Macaulay's reports of Select Committee of the British Parliament. The concepts of merit-based civil services in India was provided in 1854. For this purpose, Civil Services Commission was set up in London and competitive examinations started in 1855 in the London itself. The Government of India Act 1919 provided for separate examinations for the Indian civil services, which was to be held in 1990s. It started in 1922, first in Allahabad and later in Delhi. In 1941, in Indian civil services, the percentage of Indians was as compared to the Europeans. Question 18. By which of the following acts the system of chambers of the princes with 120 was created? 1919. According to the Act of 1919, the system of chambers of the princes with 120 members was created. The chambers of princes was established by King Emperor George versus proclamation of 23 December 1919 after the Government of India Act 1919 was given a royal assent. The chamber was formed to provide a forum in which the rulers of the princely states of India could voice their needs as aspirations to the colonial government. The annual meetings for the chambers of province was presided by the Viceroy of India. It was an advisory body. The first chancellor of the chamber of Maharaja of Bikaner, Ganga Singh. Which of the following election of the central legislative was held under the Government of India Act 1926 and 1945? According to the questions, in the year of 1926 and 1945, the election of the Central Legislative Assembly was held under the Government of India Act 1990. In which year the last elections of Indian legislature under the Government of India Act 1990 was held? 1945. Under the Government of India Act 1990, the last election was Indian legislature was held in 1945. The government of the power of the president to issue ordinance in relic of Government of India Act 1935. Although the British India, the Viceroy was empowered to promulgate ordinance without the permissions of Legislative Council under the Indian Council Act 1861. However, the President's to promulgate ordinance Article 123 is inspired by sections 42 of the Government of India Act 1935. Which of the following acts introduced the principle of constitutional autocracy? The Government of India Act 1935. The principle of constitutional autocracy was introduced by Government of India in 1935. This act vested the executive authority of the province in the governors and of the center in the governor generals on behalf of the crown. The distribution of the power between central and the state in the Constitution of India is based on which of the following plans? Government of India Act 1935. The separation of power was made by the Government of India Act 1935. It divided the legislative power between the central and the province legislatures and replaced hierarchy in the province with the hierarchy at the center. The act also envisages establishment of Federation of India made up of both British India and some of the princely states. However, this part was never implemented. Question 34. One of the amongst the following was not a silent feature of the Government of India Act 1935. The Act provided for an all Indian Federation residual subjects were allocated to province legislature. It marks the beginning of the province autonomies. It abolished hierarchy at the provincial levels and introduced it at the central. So, residuary subjects were neither allocated to the central nor provincial legislature. Residuary power were vested in the Viceroys, Governor General of India. But B is not a salient feature of the Government of India Act. So इसका बी ऑप्शन होगा, नॉट salient feature था. The act provided for all India Federation, ठीक है. It marks the beginning of provincial autonomy. सही है. It abolished hierarchy at the provincial level and introduced at the central levels. Correct. Question 25. Which among the following introduced provincial autonomy in the British Indias? Cabinet Mission Simon Commission's Government of India Act 1935. Which of the following introduced provincial autonomy in British India? So option Government of India Act 1935 C is correct. The provincial autonomy in British India was initially introduced by the Government of India Act 1919, in which central's control over province was relaxed by separation of central and provincial subject. It also separate provincial budget from the central budget and authorized provincial legislature to enact their budgets. The Government of India Act 1935 further extended and established provincial autonomy. Jharkhand Public Service Commission in the first answer key validate option C as the correct answer, but further it amended answer key and option D was chosen as a correct answer. So ऑप्शन डी इसमें गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया एक्ट 1919 A federal system and hierarchy at the center was introduced. Government of India Act 1935. The Act of 1935. Federal system and hierarchy at the central levels. The provision for establishment of all India federations was included in Government of India Act 1935. Which of the following acts provided for the federal polity in India's Government of India 1935 Act 1935? In the federation established by the Government of India Act 1935, residuary power were given to Governor Generals. In the federation of establishment by the Government of India Act 1930, residuary power were given to Governor General. ना कि फेडरल लेजिस्लेचर, प्रोविंशियल लेजिस्लेचर, प्रोविंशियल गवर्नमेंट, तो गवर्नर जनरल्स. द systems proposed under the Government of India Act 1935 was Federation of Indias. Which one of the following is not an important and permanent constituents in the constitutional history of India also adopted in the Government of India Act 1935? A written constitution for the country. The provision for written constitution of the country was not mentioned in the Government of India Act 1935. The demand for the constitution was accepted in the principles by British government in what is known as August Offer of 1940, in which the British concurred that the framing of the new constitution should be primarily the responsibilities of Indians themselves. In 1942, Sir Stafford Cripps, a member of the British cabinet, were come to India with the draft proposal of British government on framing of an independent constitution to adopt after the World War II. So option A is correct, a written constitution of the countries. Question 32. Why the Government of India Act 1935 is important? It is the main source of Constitution of India. It gave independence to India. It envisages partition of India. It abolished natives. So option A is correct. It is the main source of the Constitution of India. The Government of India Act 1935 is an important source for the Constitution of India. Many provisions of the Indian Constitution, like federal government hierarchy at the centers, distribution of power between center and the state, establishment of federal courts have been taken from it. So many provisions हमने 1935 एक्ट से लिया गया. फेडरल गवर्नमेंट हुआ, डायरकी एट द सेंटर हुआ, डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन ऑफ पावर बिटवीन सेंटर एंड द स्टेट हुआ, एंड एस्टेब्लिशमेंट ऑफ फेडरल कोर्ट्स हैव बीन टेकन फ्रॉम इट. क्वेश्चन 33. Which of the following acts led to separation of Burma from India's Government of India Act 1930? Burma was separated from India in 1937 according to the provision of Government of India Act 1935. So friends, हमने acts passed under the British Crown 1858 to 1947 तक के थ्योरी पार्ट एंड MCQs लगभग 33 क्वेश्चन कंप्लीट कर लिए. अब नेक्स्ट वीडियो में हम कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल असेंबली एंड मेकिंग ऑफ द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशंस की वीडियोस अपलोड करेंगे. इनके थ्योरी पार्ट पढ़ेंगे और इनके क्वेश्चन करेंगे. सो फ्रेंड्स, इस वीडियो में इतना ही. सो प्लीज़ लाइक, शेयर एंड सब्सक्राइब द चैनल. थैंक यू.